Zionism is, in my view, a very bad idea. It's a bad idea for two reasons. One is because it embarks those people who believe in it on a hopeless quest to resolve contradictions, the intensity of which has to resolve because the quest involves increasing violence and state, terror. Indeed, and we can go into that if you like. It's also a bad idea because practically it's totally impossible to avoid these people. I mean, when you pitch your tents in the midst of the center of the Islamic and Arabic world, where hundreds of millions of people are living there, not just the peoples in the immediate, Palestinian enclaves, but the peoples in the surrounding countries, radiating out, hundreds of millions of people. These people are A, going to hate you, and B, are not going to be able to be forgotten. This is very different, I might say, to similar projects, because the Zionist project was not that different from other projects of what we might call settler colonialism, where settlers came and then colonized the land in which they settled. You've heard of some of these, right? You know what I'm talking about, okay? But the settler colonial enterprises of the Americas, okay, had a very different set of problems to face. And one of the problems they didn't have to face was a very numerous indigenous people who were highly organized in the center of great empires that were going to always outnumber them. Okay, the indigenous people, the Aboriginal people, the American Indians, the First Peoples, whatever you want to call them, were unfortunately able to be pushed aside. They were pushed aside at a tremendous mental cost to these nation states. Any Zionist knew from the very beginning that they were going to be much too weak to do this on their own. And although their impulses ostensibly included a desire to escape Europe with its dreadful anti-Semitism and its terrible internal conflicts that it was going to explode in the 20th century, and the horrific class warfares and the annihilations of the Nazis, etc., although they knew that, they wanted to get away from Europe. They wanted to leave Europe, but in leaving Europe, they had to find a land, a state that would be assigned to them by some power. And actually, some of them went to, it wasn't necessarily Europe at the first. Herzl spent time in Istanbul talking to the Ottomans because he thought maybe they would assign the country to the Zionists. But the Ottomans, of course, were not interested in doing that. However, it came about, needless to say, as you should know, that Great Britain did show an interest by 1917, after a great deal of manipulation and very complex back and forthing, which I don't need to go into, except to say one very important thing about it. And that is that by this time, the Western powers, of which Great Britain was the leading one, had realized that they were going to need to develop inroads into the Middle East. They were going to need the resources of the Middle East. British foreign policy was very clever, ambiguous, subtle, full of its own contradictions, but it had a very clear-sighted notion that like any good imperialist, that they were going to have to control resources. And one of the most important considerations here was the fact that in 1915, Winston Churchill, then Lord of the Admiralty, had changed the British Navy from coal-burning ships to oil-burning ships. Okay, British Navy is the keystone of British power, and Britain now has to start looking around for sources of oil and ways to control sources of oil. Well, they already knew that the Middle East had a lot of that, and that was one determinant and one that looms over the rest of the history of this land. So I mentioned it, I single it out from among the other massive determinants, which are very complex, but sort of secondary in their true historical significance. In this sense, okay, the Zionist project only succeeded insofar as it drew upon the imperial powers of Europe and later Americas to the very powers that they thought they were going to escape from. They became the cat's paws of. They became the instruments of, okay? That is something that has gone on throughout. And this gets me into the point I wanted to make a little earlier, which very few people quite get, and that is, why are the Zionist lobbies in the United States in particular, why is there so much more obscurantism? Why does the debate so putrid and paltry and inane in our country? Why is the media so turned away from covering this? Why is academia so cowardly on this subject, which indeed they are? Well, the answer is because Israel is totally dependent upon the United States. Totally dependent upon the United States. In Israel is just itself. And they can afford to look at what's happening. They can afford to inquire into the true conditions of the life they have wrought through the Zionist project. They can afford to see, and in fact the Israeli internal media, not that they do anything useful with it, I don't want to go that far, but the Israeli internal media will talk freely, for instance, about the fact that this is a society with a tremendous amount of racism. They'll say, how could we as Jews who always believed in such virtues and so on be so racist? How could we even do things like apartheid South Africa? The notion that Israel has apartheid tendencies, okay, is one that is talked about in Israel itself. It is hellish to talk about this sort of thing in the United States for the simple reason that if in the United States, and I talk about Canada here too, but I can only really refer to the United States, and anyhow, the United States is a much more serious case of the disease that you suffer from too in this country, namely obscuring debate on this subject. If in the United States there was free and open debate on the subject of Israel and Zionism, it is very likely that there will be a serious weakening of the support of the United States government. And at that point, there would be major, major problems for the state of Israel. Because, in fact, although it's extremely powerful, it's third or fourth leading army in the world and so forth, it's very wealthy, it has the highest percentage of new millionaires in the last 5 years and so on. So it's extremely fragile. Its power is not derived from any kind of organic relationship to a territory. It has no actual industrial base. It has no fixed boundaries. In fact, that's an odd thing about the state of Israel. You know, it never even allowed itself to postulate any boundaries because the Zionist enterprise wouldn't settle for any boundedness. It has to be the possibility of endless expansion and the like. But it has no clear, coherent boundaries. It's surrounded by hundreds of millions of people who hate it and the like. It only survives because of the prodigious amount of support from the U.S. state and civil society and civil societies throughout the Western world. Okay, and if that debate were opened, it would be catastrophic for Israel if it went badly. And if it went to make it go badly, all you need to prove is a resolution that the United Nations, in fact, had passed in the 1970s, namely that Zionism equals racism. You know, the United Nations said that, thanks to, Palestinian pressure at the time. It was beaten back. The United States went crazy to beat it back. Finally, under the aegis of John Bolton, who was an ardent Zionist of the Christian persuasion, that's an important category to bear in mind, who was the ambassador to the United Nations under Bush and recently had to drop out. But Bolton has always been a great friend of Israel. In the 1990s, he managed to twist enough arms in the United Nations to actually get them to rescind this notion that Zionism equals racism. In the year 2001, there was a great big conference in Durban where the issue was raised once more, this time by peoples from around the South, and it would definitely have been passed, except that Colin Powell, the Secretary of the United States, took this seriously enough to go in, bluster, threaten, and eventually walk out of that conference and hence sort of demolish the value of that conference, because everything they passed would then not have any official certification of any sort. It could just be marginalized. If it were held that the state of Israel and Zionism that animated it were in fact racist, not just psychologically racist, but structurally racist, because that racist in a way that demanded the imposition of racism on an expanding scale throughout the polity, if that were the case, it would be very, very hard to sustain the degrees of support that it has. And hence, Zionist powers, Zionist lobbies, Zionists in the U.S. government, of which there are many, 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 under the name of neoconservatives, and the like, would be deeply threatened, okay? And they're threatened anyhow because things are going against them. And I'll terminate with that in a little bit. And I just want to emphasize to you that if that were the case, then right-thinking people who are of goodwill and who believe in the standard of universal justice, people who believe that human beings have a common value by virtue of being a human being, that no human being or no human group is inherently better than any other, okay? If you believe in that, then you are led to take a very dim view of a government which mandates racism on an expanding scale. And any settler colonial state must do that, especially if it espouses high universalizing ideals. And we must remember that it came to pass that another racist state, namely South Africa, which was founded in its apartheid form in the same year that the State of Israel was founded, and the same year that the United Nations passed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948. Okay, that state was eventually brought before the bar of human justice. Okay, and the reason was that people said it is intolerable to have a state that systematically, racistly oppresses another people within its boundaries. That is unacceptable to advanced human society. We must get beyond that. The level of abstraction here is not whether it's apartheid or not, but whether it's state-induced racism or structural state racism, okay? If a state behaves that way, then that state should be changed. We believe that in the case of South Africa. People are very loath to even immediately to contemplate that at all in the case of the State of Israel, as we know, and that's a function, of course, of the power of the Israeli lobby and the power of the ideological forces that it can marshal, particularly very strong and residual elements of terror and deep angst stemming from the Holocaust, which was the one phenomenon that put Zionism over the top, unfortunately. But nonetheless, those are completely without legitimacy because you cannot justify present injustice by what has been done to you in the past. And if a state is incapable of fulfilling human rights, then it should be changed. It should be transformed. I don't mean in a violent way. That's not the point. You don't have to change a state in a violent way, although sometimes South Africa had a war, but once it was decided to liquidate the apartheid state, the liquidation went rather smoothly. Nobody had to be killed. Nobody needed to lose their life. War criminals should be punished, yes, but they don't have to be executed. If the state is decent, if it has a decent constitution, shouldn't have capital punishment, that's for sure. So there's nothing inherent in the notion that a state can be transformed to nothing inherent in the transformation of a state that any great violence need be done. And indeed, I think violence will be done to the State of Israel unless people wake up and recognize the fact that this is a state that has been moving in a catastrophic direction. And in fact, people are waking up to that fact. I think that, to that truth. There are a lot of interesting changes going on, a lot of things happening in the State of Israel and in Zionism that deserve to be emphasized here. It's not widely known, for instance, that fully 750,000 Israelis now choose to live outside the country. That's about 20% of the population. No, that's not 20%. No, it's about 15% of the population. It's a lot of the population. They don't even want to live there anymore, okay? Because I don't think anything has been worse for the Jewish people than the State of Israel. Having to defend an organization that basically functions through the criminal expropriation of another people, denies it to the world, engages in an expanding set of human rights abuses, flouts the United Nations, builds nuclear weapons in secret, refuses to sign any covenants, considers itself above the law, creates conditions in occupied territories which should never have been occupied by international law, creates conditions that are, strictly speaking, subhuman, and builds a wall to extensively protect itself against bombers and terrorists, and in the meantime steals another 10% of the land of the people that they've already stolen, just about everything from, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on and on and on. The question is, well, what to do about it? Well, the official assumption is Palestinians need their state alongside the Israeli state, two-state solution. Well, here's where I want to say another reason why I don't like the idea that Israel is an apartheid state. The reason is I think it's a sub-apartheid state. Israel is postulated on this notion, as I pointed out in Herzl, and you can validate this through any reading of the history of Zionism and of Israel. And there's a book, by the way, by a Palestinian scholar named Nur Masala, which is called The Expulsion of the Palestinians, and it just consists of hundreds of quotes from Zionist leaders from the beginning to 48, just on this subject. Since then, there's many hundreds more. The fact of the matter is that the Zionist state, the kind of racism that it expounds, is not based upon apartheid principles. The apartheid regime of South Africa built these things called Bantustans, which were reasonably compact, well-defined statelets that gave the blacks who lived there, different tribes and there were 8 of them, a reasonable life, a completely inhuman life, because they had no true freedom, they had no power, they had no economy that was worth a damn, it was given on the worst land. But they did have reasonable security, they had schools, they had health systems, they had a sort of government. And the reason for those reasons was that the South African state was an industrial power and wanted to preserve the labor power of the blacks for working in the mines and the mills of South Africa and to keep them quiet. And so they built the apartheid Bantustan system. Now, I just want to say that the Bantustan system of South Africa, which was the foundation of apartheid, was a 2-state solution or an 8-state solution. It doesn't matter. And the 2-state solution that they're talking about for Palestine merely raises Israel to the level of South Africa apartheid. Okay. I say it's not apartheid now. It'll become apartheid if they have a 2-state solution. Because then the Palestinians will have their little Bantustan state, their little statelet. They won't have any real power. They won't have any economy to speak of. The place has been ruined by years of predation of one form or another. And maybe they'll be able to work again in the Israeli weapons factories, which is the only major source of revenue for these. I don't think that's acceptable, okay? It's not possible either. The only possible thing is to think beyond the existing situation, the state of Israel. It's very hard, it's very difficult, but it's humanly worthwhile. It's a strategic goal, which some people call the single-state solution, that there should be a single democratic state for all the people. It's nothing that can take place all at once. It will be very difficult, but there are many, 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 many people, organizations who are willing to undertake this. Thank you. You want to call on people?
Yeah, I'll just call them.
Yeah, why don't you do it? Yeah, that's good.